Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we are talking about the left. Today talks too much about the left. No, actually, I got that wrong. The left today talks about the left too much by Sam Badger, friend of the show and actually one of my patrons. I like Sam's writing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this as a brief piece, but it's something I think a lot about because I used to be involved in the left critique of the left all the time, but it seems like there's more left critique of the left than there actually is trying to figure out what the hell we should be doing sometimes. And I wanted to talk about that. The left, center, and right are useful concepts, but these have become increasingly uncritical abstractions and conceal as much as they reveal, as any concept that has category inflation over time does. But anyway, back to this. Between 1847 and his death in 1883, perhaps the most prolific critic of left-wing politics was Karl Marx. From his publication of The Poverty of Philosophy to the posthumous publication of the critique of the Gotha program, Marx repeatedly took his few socialists and communists to task. Yeah, I mean, Marx is the left critique of the left guy. And cool. Yet, unlike the left of today, he never framed this as criticism of the left or leftist, nor, for that matter, did he criticize the right. In fact, he and his comrade Friedrich Engels rarely use those terms, like hardly at all, actually. Even though they're in the revolutionary tradition he was often writing about, he doesn't talk about them all that much. Whenever they did, it was usually to refer to some parliamentary faction or faction within a broader political movement. So relative to the state they were talking about. Instead, he pretty much always critiques specific ideological tendencies across the political spectrum. Anarchist, petit bourgeois socialist, feudal socialist, bourgeois socialist, the Chartists, the mutualists, the monarchists, liberals, Malthusians, Lassalleans, Proudhonists, Bakuninists, and so on. And usually he's actually critiquing their ideas, not just the concept of these categories. The terminology of right and left goes back at least to the French Revolution, as the radicals sat on the left of the assembly while the conservatives sat on the right of the assembly. The left were egalitarians and Republicans, while the right were generally monarchists or constitutional monarchists or whatever. Thus, the concept of left and right existed as early as the 1790s, although you'll notice it's after the American Revolution. However, it was used more sparingly. The left, the right, and the center were not objects of critique or defense as such. They were positionalities in a broader political spectrum. Like I said before, these are directional metaphors based off of, 18th century parliamentarism in France. The left today is rather different. In fact, sometimes it can seem like the left today cannot stop talking about the left. And yes, I'm aware of the short essay as only contributing to the phenomenon, but I must contribute to it to critique it. There are progressives who struggle to make Democrats a left-wing party by displacing the centrists in favor of the Bernie Sanders-style leftists. Liberal centrists in the Democratic Party rather worry about the left has too much sway over the Democrats. The media outlets like Sublation Magazine that focus on criticizing the left from the left, and political discussion groups like Platypus International that intend to, quote, teach a history of the left to itself. Bernie Sanders warns us that the left has lost the working class. While some insist the left needs to be more woke or is too woke, depends on whether or not they are right-wing or left-wing themselves, and others exist the opposite, arguing that the left is in fact not woke. Susan Nyman did that in a book, and she's not the only one. This is not just an American phenomenon. In Germany, major socialist party on the political spectrum is Die Linke, the left, and in France, left-wing parties rally around La Gauche, also the left. While in the United Kingdom, Labour Party has been riddled with conflicts between the left and the center across its history, culminating in the rise and fall of Jeremy Corbyn. India has its own left front, constituted primarily by communist parties, although ones with more social democratic policies than you would expect. They won't like me saying that, but that does tend to be the fact. Although most of their communist parties actually do have a historical relationship to the Comintern. The list goes on. When and why did this change? As far as I can tell, and I'm still researching this question, people began discussing the left with more frequency at the time of the German and Russian revolutions. The former was a failure, the latter was a success. Well, depending on who you ask, that's in the original. The origins can be traced perhaps to the conflict between the reformists, who aim to realize socialism by reforming capitalism, and their critics in the German Social Democratic Party. Later, during the Russian Revolution, the Socialist Revolutionary Party split on left and right lines, where the left joined with the Bolsheviks while the right opposed them. This is when the Mensheviks split into white Mensheviks and red Mensheviks. Yes, Virginia, there was such a thing as red Mensheviks. To the left of the Bolsheviks, various anarchists and council communists argued that the Bolsheviks failed to fulfill the promise of the revolution, and against them Lenin wrote Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, where he leveled many criticisms against the left communist and the Italian left faction, etc. Later, the Bolshevik Party would face factionalism between the left of the party around Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev, the left opposition. I think we over-focus on Trotsky and the left opposition. He's just the most famous one. The right of the party around Bukharin and the center of the party around Stalin, though these categorizations were not always fixed, and we all know who won. I mean, Bukharin, for example, was originally part of the left faction of the Bolsheviks, and from like in the 19-teens, he was actually considered one of the left-wing members of the party. He was always reminding Lenin of things he said in State and Revolution that Lenin kind of sometimes didn't want to really focus on, but his focus on the peasants and on markets led him to be considered part of the right of the party, as well as in the 1920s and the debates around socialism in one country, socialist revanchism, could it fall back into capitalism, or socialist internationalism, which Trotsky went back and forth between the two of those positions, by the way. Bukharin was the person who came up with the phrase socialism in one country. Likewise, the splits with the German left led to conflict between the communists and the social democrats in post-war Germany. Also between the social democratic right, Ebert, and people to the right of him, some of whom became members of the Nazi Party, and other people inspired by Fichte and whatnot. The center, which is Kautsky's, and the left, which was broadly associated with Luxemburg's group. Although even that's a little bit too simple. Between the communists and the social democrats in post-war Germany, particularly during the abortive revolutions that led to the murder of the communist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, up to Hitler's consolidation of power, these two parties would battle over leadership of the German left and the working class, with the KPD, the Communist Workers' Party, actually doing also pretty well. These conflicts were echoed across the globe as conflicts between moderate social democrats, more radical social democrats, and socialists, and various factions of communist struggle for the mantle of leadership of the left. This reflected on the other side of the political spectrum, like the fascist movement, who tried to fuse the political far right with a handful of left-wing ideas to overcome the moderate right. You know, the left-right synthesis in fascism, which doesn't end up being centrist at all. It ends up being whatever fascism was. They always argued themselves the third positionists, so they were beyond left and right. So there you go. This discourse would be fully normalized by the time of the Cold War, with the left, the center left, center right, and right, as well as the far left and far right, where an international left around the Soviet Union and its allies struggled against more moderate political forces, often in alliance with the right around the United States and its allies. ? This gets complicated when the Sino-Soviet split happens, though, and that leads to a big problem. I mean, that's why there's, you know, a whole lot of our discussion about Western Marxism today does not deal with the Sino-Soviet split in any substantive fashion. So why did this terminology emerge? In part, it was to characterize various factions to themselves, for instance, so that Lenin could situate the Bolsheviks to the left of the liberals, but to the right of the less communist and anarchist. It also was to help the factions articulate why they knew the path which revolutionary parties ought to take, either by painting other factions as too right-wing or too left-wing. In this respect, it was also suggestive of other kinds of alliances that different factions could build. The left of the Republicans, the anarchists, and the Communist Party in Spain, for instance, knew they would work together during the Spanish Revolution and subsequent Civil War, except when, of course, they didn't. Lastly, it also helped each end of the spectrum to identify what they were not, even if the far left and center left did not agree on what path to take, they all agreed that the right, as in the aristocracy and the ultra-wealthy, were dangerous. There is utility in this language. It is at heart an abstraction, and abstractions have their use. My abstract concept of the triangle is useful for me to understand specific triangles, and I can predict what properties they have. For instance, that their angle should add up to 180 degrees. I can see the following positive utility of the left, center, right abstraction for those on the political left, as well as those on the political right and center. Number one, it allows for people to identify themselves as a discrete force in politics and seek common cause with others who largely share their views. This is kind of the orientational model of politics. So you can orient around people who have a cluster of views that are clustered around yours, like family resemblance and Wittgensteinian philosophy. Usually there's certain values associated with that, although sometimes I think this is actually overstated, personally. Two, it allows people across the political spectrum to situate a viewpoint and predict what other people are likely to believe. A person on the left is more likely than not to support gay marriage, well, depending on the time period. The person on the left after, say, 2000, or the 80s, or whatever. I mean, oppose imperialistic war or support sensible workplace regulations. But these are clustered things that aren't necessarily all that related, and I do think that's important to point out. These clusters may be arbitrary or historically related, like the left is associated with gay marriage for historical reasons having to do with religion. Although there are plenty of times where left-wing states were either supportive or condemnatory of it. I mean, the Soviet Union famously had the most liberalized sexuality laws of it. So what are we to make of that? Well, that's going to depend on you. Back to Sam here. 3, it allows people to situate their views within a wider narrative of historical progress. Varn reacts to the P word. If I'm on the left, I know that I think our society has a long way to go before it is perfected. I don't know what that means. While I know my friends on the right think society ought to revert to some prior state of existence. Although, I mean, I'm not sure that that's actually all that useful about the left today, because a lot of leftists really want to go back to 1917 or 1890 or 1940 or 1935, depending on the kind of leftist they are, and they're not really that interested in today either. So, I mean, this Whiggish view of this actually does sort of make me wonder. I don't really like associating Whiggish views with the left. 4, it allows political movements in different countries to identify one another around shared principles. This is another good thing, especially by the time the Third International organized together as movements that shared common left-wing principles. During the Cold War, this would only become more true as communist and socialist parties across the globe band together despite their massive differences, except when they fought each other and fought wars with each other and killed each other en masse, Sam, but I know you know that. All right, yet today, perhaps it is worth turning a critical eye, also be vicious when used inappropriately, and can serve to conceal important particularities. The way it has been used frequently leads to the following errors. It homogenizes the zones of the political spectrum. As we saw in Marx's time, there were a panoply of left-wing political movements. There were the mutualists of Proudhon, the Lassallean socialists, the Chartists in England, the platformists. That's a little later, but the libertarian socialists who became the anarchists, this, that, and the other. Yet this is still true today. There's still an ideological panoply on the left. There are liberals, as in left liberals, mutualists, progressives. Sometimes I don't think actually have a history on the left, but came over here anyway. Anarchists, communists, socialists, and everything in between. Moreover, there are various subfactions of each of these groups, often overlapping in terms. Yeah, that gets confusing, particularly when you talk to stuff about like the difference between anarchist and communist or this and the other. Anarchist, mute, syndicalist versus anarchist, councilist versus anarchist, whatever. When we talk about the left, this homogeneity is concealed behind a broader front. In some cases, like Francis Lagauche, or France about today, this is more evident because it's an alliance of socialist, communist, and other left-wing parties. Yet in the American and British case, the variety of theoretical approaches is concealed. 2, it justifies broad generalizations. This is something I hate, when people just talk about the left does. Which left? What are you talking about? It's almost always a straw man, even when leftists do it. As the left hegemonizes the left and conceals its internal variety, it often fuels broad overgeneralizations about the character of the left as whole. This is also true for the right, by the way. By turning a whole polymorphic category into a single kind, one can make sweeping and oversimplistic judgments about the whole, which simply do not accord with reality or accord with even a model of reality. That's me adding that. 3, it implicitly removes individuals from the categories they are critiquing. When the leftist critiques the left, they are implying that while they are on the left, they are no longer, nonetheless, the entirety of the left has some fault or failure that only they can see. This is the self-flattering thing that I hate so much. I talk a lot about self-flattery because it's very obvious in a lot of these cases. Anyway, despite appearing as a form of self-critique, it is in fact implicitly factional by rejecting the rest of the left. So you're setting yourself up as a sect of one, or your sect as the sect of one. See this in religion too. In fact, religion's where this rhymes the most. Even if the substance of the criticism has massive kernels of truth, this self-exclusion is ultimately self-serving. It presents the critic as one with the truth and the entirety of the left as a need for the truth. This is important. 4, it facilitates a kind of naive purity politics. I don't think purity politics is all that real, but that's just me. Frequently, when leftists criticize other leftists, they do so to deny that the other factions are really left-wing and thus wrong. This may as well be the case for positions they are criticizing are wrong. For instance, the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, opposed gay marriage for various reasons. I do not like this position and think it is misguided, but I do not make the reason why it is a mistaken position any clearer by saying that it exposes the KKE as a right-wing party, at least right-wing in general, and not just right-wing on a specific issue, is what I would say. The problem with this position is that it shows that the KKE's leftism is impure, rather that their theory on gender politics is hopelessly outdated and confused by overly focusing on the reproductive function of marriage, or just because they liked the USSR during war communism period. Anyway, back to this. It calcifies political dogma. By describing political views as on the left, we risk turning it into mere dogma. I mean, we miss doing that. We risk doing that in a lot of ways. This is not the only way to do it. It lays out a series of positions that people on the left ought to support, even if there's no logical relationship between them, whether or not they have any kind of theoretical understanding of why we believe these things. For instance, if I describe being pro-immigrant as a leftist view, I say nothing about the theoretical reasons why pro-immigrant politics are important, or why there might be leftists who legitimately disagree with it. Rather, I am just making a normative claim about what other people on the left ought to believe. I myself am pro-immigrant. I don't know what that means, but I tend to be relatively pro-migrant as well. But the reason why it is not is because it is a leftist view, but for a host of other reasons that I should be able to explain in and of themselves. So I'm not hiding my inability to explain a position I have emotively by just labeling as something that leftists believe, thus I believe it. All right? It makes politics narcissistic. This is interesting. Perhaps the most dangerous flaw of the terminology alongside, 1, the more the left discusses itself, the less it centers the social class as it is intended to represent. You know, the left critique of the left unity as opposed to working class unity, et cetera, et cetera. I've talked about the problems of this in the past. Historically, the left was clearly united in advancing the interests of the working class first and foremost, and this was its defining feature. Most importantly, not the present one in the original French left though importantly, not the one present in the original French left in the 1790s. I botched that the first time. Over time, this would be extended to women and minorities. For instance, when Marx unabashedly supported the Union during the cause of the Civil War to abolish slavery, and his general anti-slavery positions in general, even if he had other bigotries, which he did have. The more the left talks to itself about what is and what it ought to believe, the less it is talking about into workers, colonized people, peasants, paupers, immigrants, the unemployed, etc. Anyone it claims to speak for, which is actually sort of weird. The workers no longer are the object of political action, but the left as a political faction. Thus the subject of the political subject of the left becomes, that's a weird sentence, the subject of the left becomes not workers, or marginalized groups, or the oppressed. And there are problems with all of those frameworks. I tend to like the worker framework myself because it's the clearest. But about left factions themselves. And all it takes to be a left faction is to identify as a left faction and to hold some cluster of values related vaguely to that, even though it might have not much to do with your own politics. Such large swaths of the left risk becoming, and functionally are, just circles of political activists talking to themselves about what they ought to believe, thus policing themselves and trying to form a social movement without a social basis for that social movement, and ought to do without thinking about who they ought to be organizing, or how they ought to be responsive to that, or what inputs the organized people should have into it. I added those last bits, but it's super important. None of this is to say that the language of left, right, and center ought to be abandoned. Usually when we abandon them, it doesn't go well. We've tried many times. It does have some utility, and there are real historical reasons why it came into being. We live in the world created by the conflict between Bolshevism, social democracy, liberalism, and fascism, and from the United States to China, these ideologies remain dominant in one form or another. So as long as these terms help us understand and explain the world, there is use for them. Nor is the phenomenon unique to the left. Absolutely, it's actually probably worse than the right. It's also prevalent on the right and the center. As religious conservatives, cultural conservatives, I added that, paleo conservatives, I used to be one of those guys, neoconservatives, capitalists, libertarians, theocrats, nationalists, and fascists define themselves as the right. Well, some fascists don't actually, but most do. But some do actually define themselves as just being beyond the whole thing. And the political establishment define themselves as the center, standing against both political, quote, extremes. And so much of these terms have certain advantages and drawbacks for leftists, they also do for the right. Language like the right homogenizes these very different groups, justifies overbroad generalizations, and so on. The same can be said for language for the center. Although the center, weirdly, has less clear factions because it seems to be defined by what everyone else is doing. We need to be wary of how these terms have become reifications. We have created this abstractions for historically specific reasons, both theoretical and practical, but the category appears to us today simply as a brute fact. You know, it has facticity, even though it's just a category. We forget the historical origins of these terms, even if we are aware of their genesis in the French Revolution. We forget why they became popular, and in doing so, we forget the nature and limitations of these categories. Of course, if there is one critical lesson from Marx left for the left, it is to ruthlessly critique reifications, so we are not unwittingly subject to their theoretical and practical risks, which is something I try to do here. There's a good reason why I call Marx the most insightful thinker in the history of the left, probably. I really love Marx, but even I'm not willing to be that superlative all the time. Did not treat the left as an object of critique or support in itself. I mean, like I said, he rarely used the term. He used it sometimes, but not a ton. Instead of abandoning language outright, we ought to be more sparing in how we use it and when and for what purposes. When we're critiquing ideas, we should critique the ideas directly, not just the left, whatever the fuck that is. That's me adding that. We also ought to be more self-aware of the limitations of this language. It's directional. There's no platonic form of the left, and how it can conceal or mislead as much as it reveals. I see it concealing a lot these days. And we ought to at least talk about the left as homogenous a lot less and speak more about the various factions, tendencies, and theories that constitute it. Same with the right. Probably even the center, although the center is, like I said, seems to be defined so much by what everyone else is doing, it's harder to find long historical tendencies in the center. I don't know what the center of the 19th century has that much to do with the center of the 21st century. I don't know that Tocqueville and Joe Biden would have a whole lot to talk to each other about, or the bulwark with talking to, I don't know, John Adams. Nonetheless, there you go. I mean, these are the kinds of things you need to think about when you use this term, the left. Is it explaining things or is it not? I think this with a lot of terms that we've thrown around to the point of meaninglessness are terms that I don't find particularly coherent, and it's a problem. All right. like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have all kinds of options. You can get more of this. I do all kinds of stuff behind a paywall. Let's say all kinds of stuff. Most of the stuff I actually do, I provide for here for free. But if you want audio forms of all this, because you don't have to see my stinking mug, you can totally do that. It's $4 to get all the audio with additional audio for shows behind the paywall, like Diving into the Wreckage with Sean KP of Antifada, Parallax Vlog with JG Michaels of Parallax Views, and streams with Gene, although those are usually publicly available, but some of them are behind the paywall, as well as bi-monthly. Is that every 2 months? Yeah. Well, every Q&As with me every 2 months. Hopefully, access to a massive archive of my prior podcast appearances, including ones that are not easily to find elsewhere. And you can have all that for as low as $4 a month. $6 a month gets you video for most things. $10 a month gets you the ability to give me directions on things like what essays I'm going to cover. And $15 a month gives you my undying loyalty and your name permanently in the free podcast feed, because you guys are making that happen. All right. You can also find the free podcast feed if you don't want to subscribe, and get the interview shows for free about a month after they come out on the YouTube channel and the Patreon. So sometimes it's 2 or 3 months after I've recorded them, but nonetheless, you can get them. That's the end of the ad portion of the show. It's always weird doing a left-wing show that's relatively egalitarian-oriented and then having to do the buskering at the end. Such is the life of a teacher who is also a part-time rentier of ideas. The weirdest kind of rentier. On that note, good evening. And protect.